Hello, and welcome to Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents A Conversation with S.J. Bennett. As a child of an Army officer, Sophia Bennett has lived around the world, including Hong Kong and Berlin, where the Berlin Wall ran through her back garden. Her love of travel has stayed with her, and she has lived and studied in France and Italy. And she has earned a PhD in Italian literature at Cambridge, which she used that knowledge in her career as a management consultant. But she always wanted to write stories, and winning a writing competition launched her on a decade-long career as a children's book writer, before turning to her first love of mystery fiction, and this time with Queen Elizabeth II as her amateur detective. She has published 4 books in the series, the latest of which is A Death in Diamonds, and the 5th book, The Queen Who Came In from the Cold, comes out in November. Sophia, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I'm delighted to talk with you. This is not an insult, I must admit, but I read your book in 2 days, just in the last 2 days. I was absolutely jammed for time with other commitments. And the only problem I really had was that I wanted to read it carefully, because every scene, every conversation, every clue I wanted to read it all carefully, because I just got really absorbed by the story. And thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted. I like to make my readers work.
Well, you had so many details in it. You know, you obviously have done the research well. This is a book that is set in 1957. And Queen Elizabeth was, 6 years on the throne by that time?
Yeah, about that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
52, she became queen, and 53, her coronation.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So you had, I want to talk about the book first, because, of course, I just got finished reading it. And I want to really tell people, you should read this. This is really good. So you have Queen Elizabeth as your amateur detective, but of course she can't go out and do things like you would expect a detective to do. As you mentioned, I think, and I agree with you, she's actually more like Nero Wolfe needing an Archie Goodwin as her assistant,
Yes.
right?
Yes, that was my model for creating this kind of environment. Absolutely. Thank goodness I read the Nero Wolfe books growing up, thanks to my mother, because otherwise I would have been stuck, I think, as how does this woman solve crimes when she's got such a sort of restricted life? But I'm a massive Archie Goodwin fan, so I just knew I needed a character who could be sent out to go and collect clues and bring them back. And then, yeah, my rule was that all the big thinking, the big discoveries had to be done by the Queen. So her sidekick, Rosie, or in this case, Joan, she can definitely make leaps of deduction, but all the big stuff is ultimately done by the Queen back at the palace.
Yeah, I should mention that the series actually jumps from year to year, because the first book, The Windsor Knot, I don't have the information, but you have The Windsor Knot, and in our country, All the Queen's Men,
Yeah.
Murder Most Royal. They're all in different eras, right?
Well, actually, those 3 are all set in 2016 and then into 2017. So they're kind of back to back. And then I've suddenly gone back to 1957. And then I'm jumping forward 4 years to 1961. So from now on, I'm playing around a bit more.
So are you going to continue the series going from year to year chronology, or are you going to continue to jump around?
Well, what I'd like to do is kind of do trilogy. So I've got an idea that I really want to do for a book set in 66, so that this trilogy will be 57, 61, 66, so not super far apart. And by the way, this is led by the TV option, because I originally thought, I can do whatever I like, but the TV people said you can't jump around too much, because if we hire an actress and this works out, she needs to be able to do back to backs and not look too weird. So it's interesting that has kind of guided me. So yeah, I wanted to do a few set in the 50s and 60s, and then I'd love to do some 70s and 80s. 80s was when my parents got to know the Queen, so that would be really nice. And then I'd love to do some in the 90s with Diana around. Yeah, which would be interesting. So yeah, I've got a few vague storylines in my head of things I would like to cover. And And then there's one I really, really want to do, which is what would have been the fourth one. In the first trilogy is a trilogy, but I wanted it to be four, set at Balmoral in 2017. And that would be called The Day of the Corgi. And it would be it would be an assassin in the grounds around Balmoral, trying to get the Queen, and the Queen nimbly trying to evade the assassin's clutches. And that would be the kind of conclusion of the arc for my first sidekick, who's very popular with readers, which I'm very pleased about, called Rosie. So I would love to write that one.
Well, as far as I'll get into Death in Diamonds first, because it like I said, set in 1957, and it concerns a murder of a man and a woman in what in Britain is known as the Mews, which is essentially they were converted apartments from the garages, if I understand right, from
yes,
chauffeurs.
First of all, they were stables. And then they were garages, and then they put the servants in them, and now you get hedge fund managers in them. So yeah, they've changed their usage quite a bit over the years.
Yeah, I admit my wife and I were in London in September. We participated in the Agatha Christie Festival, so we actually walked through Paddington and found the Mews behind the on Queensborough Terrace, on the other side of Queensborough Terrace. And we actually, kind of wandered through like tourists, looking around, because we knew there were security cameras everywhere and really didn't want to get thrown out. So we have a very good idea. It's like a private driveway with buildings on all sides, and they're all converted like pied-à-terres or apartments, as I understand.
Yeah, absolutely. They are now. Yeah. So usually what happened was they'd be, as you say, they'd be both sides of a little cobbled street. And either side, they would back onto the garden of the big house for which they contained the cars and the servants. And some of them still do, going kind of in opposite directions. So in some of the kind of mega builds that we have in London now, you have the big house, and then under its garden, you have the swimming pool and the gym and all of those things. And then it comes up in the Mews house, kind of, yes, on the other side. And some are quite small and occasionally lived in by students and things. But they've got a lovely feel because they are these sort of little, originally kind of rickety houses on these cobbled streets. They do have a lovely sort of villagey atmosphere to them.
Yes, and one particular night, if you want to go ahead and continue with like setting up what the murders are, that sets off the book.
Well, in the Mews that I've got, it was actually chosen because it was the Mews, the real Mews, where Agatha Christie had a Mews house and converted it. And so in this particular Mews, there's a really eclectic group of people living there in the 50s. One of them rents it, and he is the Dean of Bath. Bath, by the way, doesn't have a dean, which is why I created this. So he's a senior clergyman in the Church of England, and normally he's in Bath, very Jane Austen territory. But he comes up to London occasionally, and he rents this house. And unfortunately, his cleaning lady discovers 2 dead bodies in it. One of a high-class escort wearing very little apart from a diamond tiara and some silk underwear, and then her client who is sort of horribly murdered on the floor beside her. So yes, that happens, and the story takes off, and the Queen becomes involved because early on, when she hears about it, she just notices that Prince Philip is with her at the time. And he behaves very oddly when he hears exactly where and when this murder happened. And he knew some of the people who were in the house earlier on, but he says that he has an alibi. He was at home that night in Buckingham Palace with the Queen. But we sense really early on that maybe he's not entirely telling the truth.
Yep. And yes, that is part of the background of the investigation, and also that the investigation is handed on to an inspector, Fred Derbyshire. Love the last name. And instead of the chief inspector, George Venables, who one would expect as the top investigator to be assigned to the case. So you get this idea that there are wheels within wheels here. There are reasons why things are being done that are not quite maybe kosher.
Yeah.
So you've captured a lot of the paranoia that comes from, especially from the Queen having to deal with what she termed the men with mustaches, and there's something else as well. And I hate to bring it up. I'm going to try to keep this being very spoiler free as possible. That there is problems with the Queen and her foreign visits, right?
Yes. So when we first meet the Queen, when she hears about this murder, she's actually in Paris, and she's just met the Mona Lisa, which is absolutely true. It was brought to her so that she could see it.
It was brought to her and propped on a
massive
chair, just like your kid's picture.
Absolutely. And she's at a massive evening where Le Tout Paris was there to greet her. But the evening before, she realizes she was served shellfish. And the Queen really liked shellfish, but she had very few special requests. I like to think of it as her rider. The Queen's rider was very light actually when she traveled, but one of the few things on it was no shellfish, just in case she got a tummy bug from it. But anyway, there was shellfish on the menu, so that was a bit weird. So she notices, and her speech had also gone missing. So she was going to give a speech in French. She very much was used to reading that particular version of it, and suddenly it and all copies of it had disappeared. So yes, she gets a sense that somebody who should be on her side and helping her out isn't. She has a sense of who this is, but we as readers don't find out for a while who that is. But she knows that she needs someone else to come in, somebody she can trust, to find out what on earth is going on. So she's on the lookout for somebody trustworthy to help her out. And in the way that I envisage this, this is the first time the Queen has recruited somebody to help her solve mysteries.
Mm-hmm. So you have the novel in which you have a parallel story of the investigation of the double murder and the Queen wanting to find out who is sabotaging her and why.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that brings us to, I guess, our Watson in this case, or our Archie Goodwin in this case, Joan McGraw, who has a very interesting background up to this point when she becomes essentially a typist in the press office, if I understand that correctly.
Well, yeah, just a sort of general typist at the palace. Yes. One of my favorite scenes to write is the scene where the Queen talks to Joan about Joan's career up to that point, which had started a very exciting way at Bletchley Park in the war. And then it ended very ignominiously towards the end of the war. And as a result of which, just a few years later, sort of 10 years later, there is Joan with just a typist's job at Buckingham Palace. And that's the best job that she can get. And Joan is really worried that obviously her file has been handed over to the Queen. And she's really worried that when the Queen reads it, she's going to be fired from, yet another job. But luckily, the Queen reads it very carefully. Her staff have tried to keep it from her, but she reads it very carefully, and she realizes that there's a lot more to it than you might think, and there's a lot more to Joan than you might think. And I love it as Joan gradually realizes that suddenly she's got someone who's on her side, which is the first time that's happened to her.
And somebody rather high up in the hierarchy, about as high as you could go, as a matter of fact, which is, again, another pleasure of reading this, of it's almost like a fairy tale in a way.
Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah, if the Queen decides to be your fairy godmother, she can do that. Nobody can stop her.
But even so, up to a certain point, and there's that tension that I felt throughout the book where the Queen is not all powerful. She can't just stomp around and get everything done. And she's having to rely on her advisors. There's a phrase about something being like mushrooms, kept in the dark and fed manure. And you don't quite know, she doesn't quite know who's telling her the truth. And so she needs Joan just as much as Joan needs her. But there's still a clear differentiation in power between them. So that balance is really it's quite exciting in the narrative. And then what you also have with Fred Derbyshire trying to investigate the case, and it brings him up against some unusual characters as well, because he's really having a hard time trying to find a handle on what actually happened.
Yes, there seem to be reasons as to why investigating this murder in the Mews is more complicated than it should be. Fred is a great policeman. There's Inspector Japp in the Agatha Christie books, and often, he can be a bit of a fool. And Dorothy Sayers does this sometimes in Golden Age literature. The policeman is a bit of a fool, and then the private detective comes along and is better. And I haven't done that in my later novels. I'm just interested in, well, what happens if you have an intelligent policeman who nevertheless, despite wanting to solve the crime, still can't. And so, yes, there are clearly forces making it difficult for Derbyshire to question witnesses and follow up on leads. And he's not sure why, and he's definitely not going to do what they tell him.
Yeah, he's also
somehow the Queen and Derbyshire need to ultimately connect, but it takes them a while to do.
He's also burdened by Sergeant Woolgar, his assistant, who is he's an interesting character in his own right.
I'm hugely fond of Sergeant Woolgar. Sergeant Woolgar is a very big guy, and he is a rower. And at that time, the Metropolitan Police had a very, very good rowing team, rowing 8, going up and down the river. And so he's in that, but that's kind of why he's in the police, really. And he comes across as occasionally quite scary, looming, unintelligent. But I hope the more the reader finds out about Woolgar, the more they warm to him, because I certainly do.
Yeah, you just don't necessarily want him investigating your murder.
Well, you don't want him to be the only one doing it. It's not necessarily his main focus. His main focus is an egg sandwich, really, because he's always hungry.
Yeah. And also another aspect of the book I want to bring out is the relationship among various women, because obviously this is told from Joan's point of view, and the women here are, I guess you have different reactions. I don't know how to quite phrase this properly, except that we get to see how they struggle in a society that is largely male-centered, we'll put it that way. Because you could take it with Sergeant Woolgar and how he influences conversations with some of the female witnesses in the case. Joan has to deal with the expectations of starting in as a typist and being resented by her male superiors for being there, and then when she's essentially promoted to, I think, what was it, deputy assistant to the Queen, or something like that?
Assistant private secretary, which is the job that I interviewed for, by the way. But yes, that's what she is, assistant private secretary. Yes.
Yeah, so we get to see things from her point of view, which is, as a male, I find very enlightening and very unexpected. And there's a scene in which Joan is actually taken out to dinner. Was it the Ritz?
Yes, it was.
Yes, and she understands who her female companions are at the table as well, and things happen, and it's just like, well, you get the understanding that women are basically treated as, of course, secondhand class citizens. They don't have a mind of their own, and there's only essentially one thing they're good of, and this is Joan's first experience with this.
Yeah, I hadn't originally set out to write a series of feminist novels with this. Writing about the Queen, you wouldn't think that that's what they would be, but they've increasingly become that. And they kind of were from the start. So the Queen, in many ways, you think Queen Elizabeth II, one of the most powerful women in the world. But yeah, as you said earlier, Bill, she is restricted a lot in what she can do, and at the level that she's at, she is the only woman. I talk about her in one of the other books as the only skirt in a sea of trousers. Whenever world leaders meet, there she is, but she's always unique. And she's treated as an honorary man in some ways. And then patronized in other ways, both as an old lady and as a young woman. So actually, even being the queen as a woman is not that straightforward. Yeah, I do find because I have a female sidekick, I am writing about female relationships and being in these worlds. And as you said, I was a management consultant in the 90s, and I felt hugely liberated and, not powerful exactly, but capable. And I had all sorts of opportunities, and I traveled the world. But I I nevertheless did. I went through all the things that women go through of, you say something at a board meeting and it is not heard until a man says it later. I just thought, oh, is this only me that this has ever happened to? This is weird. And all the men that I worked with were absolutely lovely, but my voice was at a higher pitch than theirs, and I just was not taken as seriously. And that was fascinating. So a lot of those experiences come into the books, and in A Death in Diamonds in particular, I really loved it. And it was an accidental thing, which is my favorite part of writing. But the moment where the queen makes a decision that ultimately helps her solve the crime, she decides to focus on the women in the crime rather than the men, which everybody else has been focusing on. That to me just summed up the whole book. When women think about women, when women help women, that can be when the world becomes a better place. And there's a lot of that in this book. And something actually that I got from, we had a horrible serial murderer called Peter Sutcliffe in the UK back in the 80s. And that his crimes have been reviewed many times. And one of the things that's come through is he was very catchable very quickly if the police had listened to local prostitutes, because all the things the police were looking for, they had seen, they knew, they said, but they were just never taken seriously. And so that has very much filtered into this book. If anyone listened to the women who are talking about this escort and her client, really listened to them, they would know which investigative paths to go down. But they don't listen. Even the nice ones don't listen. And it takes until Joan finally gets involved till they really start realizing what information is available to them. So I find myself writing this kind of feminist track, which is as much of a surprise to me as anyone, I think.
Yeah, although from my point of view, for what it's worth, I wouldn't consider it feminist. I would consider it just being an artist treating the characters as they should be treated, and speaking the truth about their how they work their way through life and how they work their way through the various encounters. And you're very honest about it. And I admit, when that sort of thing flips, and I don't want to go into the spoiler territory, it was like, as soon as the realization dawns, you go, of course, that is how it's supposed to be. That is what the truth behind the case really is. It's almost reminiscent of a favorite Christie trope: nobody notices a servant.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, you have certain people appearing who just seem so naturally there that you don't even notice who they are.
Yeah. Now, another aspect of the book I particularly appreciated were, of course, the historic cameos, I guess, which are grounded in reality, particularly Daphne du Maurier and Duke Ellington. And I actually went and listened to the suite he wrote for Queen Elizabeth yesterday after I read that particular section in the book. Is there anything you would want to? I mean, tell us a little bit about Daphne du Maurier and her relationship with the Queen.
Well, this astonished me. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Daphne du Maurier, and I grew up reading her books. So Rebecca, I'm trying to think. Of course, my mind has gone blank. Frenchman's Creek, Jamaica Inn. There were so many that I really loved, and I love the sort of darkness. And there's another woman writing about women in a really fascinating way. Anyway, so I think of her as a novelist, and I think of the Queen as a public figure over here. Anyway, but because I research what I always like to have some of the Queen's own speeches in the book, so we get what she was thinking about at the time, and we get her own words. And I was looking up her Christmas message from '57, and somebody had written that Daphne du Maurier helped her write it, and I thought, why? Why was this mystery novelist helping the Queen? How did they know each other? And it turned out that Daphne du Maurier was famously married to Boy Browning, not always very happily. But Boy Browning had worked for Princess Elizabeth and was at the time working for Prince Philip as his head of household, really important person, and very stressed out by it, actually. And Daphne was living down in Cornwall, where we kind of imagine her. But they knew the Queen and Prince Philip socially, and the Queen and Prince Philip really liked them. They had a lovely boat that I think was called Fanny that they used to travel up and down the Helford River on, near a place where I go every summer, coincidentally. So yeah, the Queen and Prince Philip really liked them. Daphne liked the Queen and Prince Philip as a couple, but didn't like royal procedures. You know, she was part of that world where things were changing, which I wanted to capture. But, you know, end of the 50s, she found it very fussy, the way that the court lived its life. But she did know them. And when the Queen needed help, she really was drafted in. And I thought, well, she has to be in my book. You know, that the idea of Daphne. In fact, I've put her at Balmoral, helping the Queen up there because it just suited my plot. She did go. And one of the things I read about when she did go was that she hated all the changing of clothes that you have to do. And I've met people who say the same things. It was just a nightmare having to travel backwards and forwards to their room the whole time to change clothes for every event. So it was really fun putting all of that in and having Daphne help the Queen in a particular way. And actually the way that she helps inadvertently was entirely stolen from a Dorothy L. Sayers short story, which is called, I think it's called Nebuchadnezzar, the Dorothy Sayers one. And I remember reading that as a teen, so it was really lovely to sort of weave it into the book.
Mm-hmm. That was very nice. And the encounter with Duke Ellington, you moved from one place to another, and that took place as well.
They were fans of each other. I just love this. I mean, one of the problems I have with the later series of The Crown, which I watched the early ones and then I didn't so much watch the later ones. And one of the reasons was, from what I could see, the Queen looked increasingly grumpy in this, you know, like she was having a miserable time the whole time. And she kind of didn't. I mean, there were times in her life, obviously, as there are with everybody, that were darker than others. But what she did have always was a massive sense of humor, huge sense of fun, great sense of mimicry, lots and lots of warm friendships, and a love of the arts, not necessarily always serious, but certainly music. Anyway, she loved jazz, and she met Duke Ellington, and she liked him very much, and he liked her. And after their very sort of jovial encounter, he did write this very, I think, you listened to it too, but I thought very beautiful suite of music for her. And he was just such a class act. So what he did was he paid for his orchestra to record it because his record company didn't want to, because he was only going to make one record, one physical record, and give it to the Queen privately and secretly, and not sell it. And so it only became known that it existed after he died in the 70s. And of course, she being her, didn't tell anyone, you know, listened to it, enjoyed it, didn't share the secret. That feeds into my vision of her as a crime solver, by the way, is she's known as a secret keeper among her friends and among people who meet her. So people tell her stuff because they know it's not going to go any further. And that helps with the crime solving too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's those little scenes like that just add so much flavor to the book, even though they have nothing to do with the plot necessarily, but it gives us a better sense of who Elizabeth is. And now there's also the question about depicting a historical character, and particularly in this case, one who was living at the time when you wrote your first couple of books. And I came across a comment by another mystery writer, Stuart Kaminsky, and said that his goal, because he wrote a number of books involving real historical people, that he wasn't trying to depict them accurately so much as using his impressions of these real people to create fictional characters. He didn't believe he was trying to depict Eleanor Roosevelt in all her complexity, but just using it as a character in a work of fiction. How do you view the real people that you use in your stories?
I agree with him. Yes. I felt I was tuning up all the characteristics the Queen really had that might have made her a great golden age detective. I was tuning those up to 11. And I was tuning down the characteristics that would have made her not want to do it or not be so good at it. So, for example, what the Queen really was, I think, was a very good delegator. And she also hated conflict. My Queen doesn't delegate crime solving, she does it. And she takes on conflict when she needs to. So she's not exactly the same as if I were to be writing a biography, it would be different. So it's interesting. Sometimes I'm sort of accused of making her more than she was. For example, I talk about her, her skin seemed to sparkle when you met her, but that is just straight out. When my mother met her, she said her skin seemed to sparkle, something to do with her foundation, her pearls, the light on her, whatever it was. That's a genuine thing. So yes, some things are just straight out real. Others I tweak when necessary. And my feeling was, as long as I'm kind to the real people I put in, and as long as they have a public life, I'm comfortable with it. So the servants are all made up, because I feel like the real ones, that's not really fair on them. So, for example, the Queen has a fantastic dresser, had in real life, called Angela, who would have been a great character, but she wasn't a public figure really. And so Angela Kelly, her name is. So I didn't put her in the books. And if anyone is really helpful in solving the murder, they're fictional as well. And if there's a real figure in there, and people might be able to guess people that I have in mind, but if there's a real figure in the Queen's life who is a public figure, but who I really don't like, they tend not to be in the book. So there are a couple of figures, one in particular, who spend a lot of the time in the Queen's life, but doesn't really appear very much in the books. But the ones who do are ones I have nice things to say about. Prince Philip, I think, is a great character. I really enjoy writing him. Princess Anne is another one I really enjoy writing. Very tough.
There was a book I had read. No, it must have been about Princess Margaret, I think. I'm sorry, I'm confusing the two. Who was Queen Elizabeth's sister?
Yes, Princess Margaret, yeah.
Princess Margaret, because it was a book, something like, it was an odd title, like 25 Things About Princess Margaret.
Oh, I know, yes, by Craig Brown.
Okay,
yes.
Okay, good, because I didn't know that much about her, but you think about her life as almost making it to the throne, and then receding further and further. And it's in a way, it's something that the Duke of Windsor had to deal with as well when you're super annotated. And what do you do with your life after that?
Oh, that's an interesting point, actually. I take it back. I don't like the Duke of Windsor at all, but I did put him in.
Oh, absolutely not. As people have said, they should put statues up in all the villages to Wallace, because she saved the monarchy.
We should be deeply grateful to her. Yeah, absolutely. We dodged a bullet there.
But you had a wonderful observation, and you wrote that up. I'd like to read just a couple of sentences as well, because it reflects on Joan understanding more about what it's like being queen. And Joan viewed these visits in an entirely different light now. Before, it had always looked easy enough to sit and wave, or stand and wave, or walk around and shake a few hands and nod at a piece of machinery. But knowing, as she did, that every 10-minute slot was accounted for, and each half hour included 100 people who could be inadvertently insulted if they weren't smiled at or asked the right question, and 20 pressmen who would be happy to capture the moment on celluloid if it happened, Joan saw each day as an endurance test. And that's just, again, this is one of the reasons why I like the book. I could pick up something like that and read the summary of it and get a little piece of knowledge I didn't have before. It's one of the reasons I really recommend this book very highly.
Oh, thank you. That's how I see the Queen. Who would do it? I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it at all. Exhausting. No wonder she occasionally looked slightly grumpy. I mean,
Absolutely. Or you have something, there was a prank Philip played on her where he dressed up as one of the guardsmen. Are you aware of that?
Well, actually, do you know what? I know the picture that you're thinking of. It's one of my favorite pictures. He was dressed as the guardsman. That was his uniform that day. What had really happened was bees had escaped from their hive at Windsor Castle. and they'd gone under the chairs of where all the guests were supposed to be sitting for whatever they were about to do. And they'd had to get the beekeeper out to come and rescue the bees. So he and she were just sharing a private laugh about the bees.
Oh,
That was going on there.
yeah, you do have to have a sense of humor. But she also, as you emphasize, she had a very strong sense of duty to her job. This was her job. She had to do it. She had no choice. I mean, well, obviously you could always have a choice, but she chose to do her duty. And you emphasize that very strongly in the book.
I do. And it's always a danger of getting too political about it. But one of the things I wanted to do was just give a sense of this historical figure, particularly from the 20th century into the 21st, who led a life of service and duty when increasingly people don't do that. And right now, in the moment that we're living in now, we're seeing what happens when people in a position of leadership don't have a sense of duty and service. And the consequences can be quite terrifying, actually. I think we perhaps took it for granted, what it was like to have someone in that role. I mean, and I think actually I have very mixed feelings about King Charles, but on the whole, they are positive, because I think we have another head of state who has a sense of duty and service. He largely has to do what he's told to do by the Prime Minister, as did the Queen. So we don't get a full sense of what he would do if he could. But it is quite relaxing, having somebody up at the top who in their heart of hearts really wants to put the people first. It's a nice feeling.
I get the sense from across the ocean, and I admit I'm an Anglophile, that there's always a struggle between, of course, there was the long struggle between the authority of the king and the authority of Parliament that has been resolved for now, that the idea of the head of state as a figurehead for the nation of things separate from politics, does that sound true, or is that?
It took us a very bloody civil war and 600 years to sort out what we really wanted. And I think we've done a pretty good job of it, actually. So we have someone who gets, the parades and the uniforms and the sparkles and the carriages and the diamonds, but they don't have a lot of real power. It looks as if they might do, but they have to use that power to do what they're told. And if they don't, well, we've seen what happened before. But somebody literally lost his head, so that they do what they're told, and that seems to work very well for us. And as you say, you might think, oh well, that's lovely if you've got all the diamonds and the carriages and you can do whatever you like, but you can't do whatever you like. You do have to go and smile at machinery and not offend people. And actually, it's really, really hard work. And if you try and just lead a private life enjoying all the riches, I don't think the monarchy would last very long at all. In return for all the diamonds and the carriages, we want to see the babies as soon as they're born, and we want to know some of the private details, and we have a constant fascination with what they're up to, and the price that they pay for their lifestyle is pretty high, I think.
Oh yeah, and you do wonder if it's really worth it.
Yeah.
For those of us who aren't born to the purple, it's easy for us to make.
Yeah, Prince Harry had a couple of lovely girlfriends early on who, the public would have happily taken on as new princesses, and they both turned the offer down. It's just like they didn't want to live a life like that. And I don't blame them. I think, if I'd have been in that position, I'd have been the same.
Yeah. And meanwhile, you have Kate, who seems to be thriving in the role. She's willing to accept it and willing to do the duty. And I assume she's fairly popular, right?
Yes, she is. I think she regularly is the most popular royal. I mean, it's really tough for her at the moment because she's been dealing with a very difficult cancer, whatever it is, but it's clearly a really tough one. So, I mean, yeah, gosh, when I set my books, when I started out to write them, the royal family were thriving. Harry was hugely popular. William and Kate were as well. So was the Queen. Harry was just about to start dating Meghan. And when he did, that was hugely popular here, massively. It was all going well. And then, who knew that the pandemic would strike and we'd lose the Queen and Prince Philip very fast. And then, yeah, massive health crises to follow. It's been one thing after another.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to capture, I never was going to write beyond 2017, but I wanted to capture them all in their kind of glowing days, I guess. I want my books to be a bit of a refuge because that's what I go to books for,
Hmm.
really. Sometimes you want to read a book that stresses you out massively, and sometimes you want to read a book that doesn't. So yeah, I mean, I hope my books will really get people's puzzle solving brains working, and as you say, hopefully teach you a few things you might not have known about what it's like to be head of state, but not be overly stressful.
Yeah, there's so many questions I really would like to ask. I'm reminded, so I'm really just going all over the place at this point. Now, your father met the Queen several times, right? What was that?
Yes.
What context?
Well, I'm trying to think. The first time that I remember him meeting was her Silver Jubilee, which is when I started getting interested in her. I was 11. It was 1977. And he was accompanying her on a tour. She toured the country massively that year. And so she went to Chester, and there's a picture of him with his sword raised, showing her around. And then, yeah, as he became more senior in the army, he met her more and more to discuss regimental issues. There was one time he co-hosted an event with her at the Tower of London. That was interesting. He was telling me because there was a point where it was just him and her, and they were going from one point in the Tower of London to another, and it involved going down a winding medieval stone staircase. And protocol demanded that she should go first, but health and safety demanded that he should go first. So he said, "What do you want me to do, ma'am?" And she said, "Oh, you go first, definitely." So he did. But the thing that actually helped me write the books was there was another time when two regiments were being merged together, and it was hugely stressful for them because a regiment has a very proud history that goes back hundreds of years, and a really strong identity, and with that comes all sorts of like silverware that they have in the mess that they celebrate victories and things. And if you merge them, a lot of that disappears and it's not privileged anymore, and their cap badges change. And it's a very stressful thing. And not many people really understood that. But the Queen did. And he said she was one of the few people he spoke to at this particular time who knew all the details and absolutely got it. And I thought, that's who I want to write about. That is the person, not just some sort of, nodding figure at a parade, but the intelligent person that you meet afterwards who knows exactly what's going on.
I got the impression from looking at your website, sjbennettbooks.com. Again, I recommend going there. That this is a bit awkward, possibly, that you're not a royalist necessarily. But you were drawn to Elizabeth as a person.
Yeah.
What about her in particular?
The things that we've been talking about, it's interesting. About a month ago, I was in Spain and I was at a crime festival, and they were saying, "Oh, do you want to write about our monarchy?" And I was like, "No, I do not. I think your monarchy is terrible. The things that Juan Carlos has got up to. No way." So from that way, I'm not a monarchist. I think the delicate thing that we've created over 600 years in a civil war, I think is very clever. And I am pro that. But it's not even that I want to write about. I want to write about this woman who took on that life, chose to do it in a way that was a life of service. Nevertheless, she knew how important she was. But she was comfortable in her importance. But at the same time, if Michelle Obama wanted to put an arm around her when they were both, sharing a moment when their heels were hurting, she was fine with that. She didn't stand on protocol that way. I completely get Michelle Obama's take, which was, here's two women just sharing a moment. I wanted to write about that and how I think the Queen was very like Shirley Temple in a lot of ways, and I think they were contemporaries. But Shirley Temple from early childhood was super famous, and yet somehow remained sane, and as far as I can tell, nice throughout her life. And Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, called the Queen Shirley Temple. But I think she was very similar. She could so easily have been a spoiled brat, but she kind of just wasn't. And that's what intrigued me. How do you stay sane? What was this person really thinking about? And how did she cope with her private life and her public life, and keep those two things going? So that's what I enjoy exploring.
Yeah. Is there, because you mentioned growing up as, an army child, we call it an army brat in the
Yeah,
States.
same.
And that meant you had different postings around the world. You had mentioned Hong Kong and Berlin in particular.
Mm.
And how did that influence you growing up? That constant moving about, that exposure to different lives and cultures?
Yeah, well, I think it's what made me a writer. I think often artists have some point in their childhood that is trauma. I mean, Tom Jones, the singer, it always fascinates me. He had, I think it was glandular fever, although I've read it was tuberculosis, but I think it was glandular fever when he was a teenager. And he spent a year of his life, aged about 13, I think, in his bedroom, watching the world go by, watching all his friends go to and from school outside his bedroom window. And I think if you get a certain distance at a crucial point in your life, it gives you a new way of looking at the world. Anyway, when we went to Hong Kong for the first time when I was 7, and I went from the school in England where, I was just one of the girls and we all had a really fun time, it took me sort of 6 months at my much bigger mixed school to find my place. And in the meantime, I did a lot of reading. So I came out of that experience as a reader and observer, and that's kind of kept me going. And then at the same time, I got the travel bug, and so I've done that as much as I can. So I've drawn, art tends to be what I go for. So wherever I travel, and I'm doing it later this month in America, funnily enough. But I love following up on the art, learning as much as I can about the artists and their lives and things, and that all feeds into what I do.
Well, especially as a child, because you're so open to experiences and you don't have a filter. So you literally get everything hitting you. And you kind of have to spend the rest of your life sorting through it.
Yeah, absolutely. Way too many experiences. Yes. I
Yeah.
find goodbyes really hard because I've had to do so many of them. I'm very good at hellos.
Yeah, I understand that as well. I think we've been talking for quite a while, so I think I would like to go ahead and let you go. I want to thank you so much for talking with us. I would also want to recommend her website, sjbennettbooks.com, because there's a book club guide there. There's sample chapters from her books. In her About Me section in particular, there's a number of book recommendations as well. And she's got some really good ones. I share a lot of them, which is why I could say you have great book recommendations. Ellery Queen, Rex Stout, and Douglas Adams in particular. Is there any other way for people to get in touch with you or to find out more about you?
I think the website is the best way to do it. And you can just email me at hello@sjbennettbooks.com. And I do answer. Some people are surprised when I email back, but I really do. Yeah, I think that's probably the best way. I have this newsletter, which you can sign up to there. And it's got about 4,000 people on it now. And it's just lovely. So I send out newsletters every couple of months or so, and I get lovely responses back. So a lot of my relationships with readers have developed that way, and that's a special thing.
Yes, and with the newsletter, you also get access to a short story about Wallace Simpson. I read it today, and it's a short story, and you could see it as a novel. Because there's so much there, and as a Sayers fan yourself, you understand the relationship between Whimsy and Harriet Vane and the path that they took, and there's a lot to think about there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yes, very much so. Well, like I say, this is Bill Peschel for Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents. Our book today was A Death in Diamonds. I recommend the series. If the rest are as good as this one, I think you're in for a really good series of reads here. And thank you very much, S.J. Bennett, for talking with us today. And I want to thank you all for tuning in. And I hope that your favorite book is the one you're reading right now. Bye-bye. Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents is sponsored by the Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. To learn more about the store, visit the website at www.mysterybooksonline.com. And thank you for listening.